Broadcasting live from Rome, this is the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender and horror. My name is Louisa, and I'm joined by my crime writers and crime fighters, Mila,
Tyia, and Zeba.
And welcome to Season 5. For our first theme, we are talking about serial killers. We will be covering the 1982 giallo classic Tenebrae, directed by Dario Argento, the 2010 Korean action thriller I Saw the Devil, directed by Kim Ji-woon, and the 2023 Canadian crime thriller Red Rooms, directed by Pascal Plante. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcast app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast. In Tenebrae, famous American crime author Peter Neal suddenly finds himself in the center of a serial killer investigation in Rome after a fan starts killing women in a fashion that mimics the plot of Peter's latest novel. The murderer makes it personal, sending taunting notes about the murders to Peter's hotel room. With the police investigation lagging behind, Peter sets out to solve the mystery of the killer's identity himself, but discovers that this evil may be closer than he thought.
The impulse had become irresistible. There was only one answer to the fury that tortured him, and so he committed his first act of murder. He had broken the most deep-rooted taboo, and found not guilt, not anxiety or fear, but freedom. Every humiliation which stood in his way could be swept aside by this simple act of annihilation: murder.
Okay, how do we feel about being 5 years in? Season 5.
We're not 5 years in.
No. Okay, bitch, this is not the time to be pedantic, okay? We are on our 5th season.
We are 4.5 years in.
We could go to kindergarten if we had a baby.
It's very surreal about it being a 5th season. In like TV shows, 5th seasons are kind of like reached a peak of quality, or it's when people completely like twist it and like try something new.
Well, this isn't a good precedent because we have tried something new. So I hope this means we'll hit the peak of quality.
I think so.
Yeah, that was a morbid, that was like a not a great crossroads to be at.
I think it's important to be self-aware in this meta-cinema episode.
I feel like we are doing the same thing. We just have a different structure of fewer episode themes and more in-depth episodes is the aim. So I think that's a fine goal. We're doing quality over quantity in season 5.
4.5 years in, this is the most excited I've been for an episode since the cult horror episode. I think this one is going to be really, really interesting and fun. We're doing some films that people have kind of requested a couple of times, and then a rather new film, which just came out in the UK and the US. So I think people will be seeing it for the first time, maybe as this episode is coming out. And we also have an interview. So I think this one is really exciting. This is our first interview that I think we've had since episode 1. But we'll be doing a lot more of that type of stuff and doing some real deep dives this season. So everything will be really exciting, new things.
Feeling very excited for some upcoming themes, some movies under certain themes that we've been waiting to do forever and ever. And I won't spoil anything about what we have on our watch list or what might be in upcoming episodes, but I'm excited to go on some deep dives and also do more horror stuff in other mediums on our Substack and other places where we're just, watching things that we might not do on a main episode, but stuff that we're excited about, and we're covering some like more new and recent movies. And Halloween is coming up. Me, in my household, in my apartment, we watch a horror movie every night of October. Send recommendations for that because we have not made our calendar yet.
It's nice to have more time, like double the time with each theme to really get into that world of that specific horror subgenre. So I'm excited to, to do that. Thank you for listening to us over the previous 4 seasons, and we hope you enjoy what's to come for this season.
The Monstrous Feminine is on Spotify, so please rate us 5 stars and leave us a comment. If you do engage with our content, you just might get a shout out on our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode's Witch of the Week is Spotify user 1159086434, who commented on our American Psycho Men in Horror episode and said, "Being gay saves the day."
Is that the lesson of American Psycho?
It is if you want it to be.
He tries to kill a gay man and he doesn't. I think there was like a blockage for him about killing a gay man.
Oh my god, you're right. So it's that guy. Yes, he doesn't kill the queer man. He's like the one person that's spared, but like other people die.
Well, user 1159086434, I hope you are having a fantastic beginning of fall, having some seasonal beverages, enjoy some festive music, make some playlists, go to some Halloween parties, have a great feral girl fall, and that all the good things come your way. The rest of this year, nothing but abundance and greatness for you. Friendly reminder that we're also on Patreon and Substack. You can find all of our links and information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
So, I had to ask our resident Italian how to pronounce this subgenre canon because I am but a silly American. And I was like, how do I say giallo, galo, giallo? And so Mila informed me that it is in fact giallo.
You say it very well.
Yeah, she said I had to say it just like that because otherwise it sounds a bit silly. So for the rest of this episode, I'll be saying giallo. No, I'll be saying giallo. I was delving into giallo as a subgenre, and I found it very fascinating. I can't wait to go and watch some of the films that I've happened upon. But essentially, as a term, according to an article on going through the greatest Italian giallo films, they mean different things. Like for Italian audiences, a giallo is just any thriller, but for English-speaking audiences, it's become a very specific type of, and I'm quoting here, Italian-produced thriller that takes advantage of modern cinematic techniques to create a unique genre which unapologetically explores violence, sexual content, and taboo exploration. I also was fascinated with this genre because as a publishing girly, it originates from like books kind of as a term. So Gary Needham for Kino Eye wrote about this, but essentially in 1929, the Milanese publishing giant Mondadori launched a line of books which had yellow covers, and these were just like translations of like British or American whodunit murder mysteries like Sherlock Holmes or stuff like kind of in the Edgar Allan Poe model. And it became very, very popular, and it led to these kind of pulpy, cheapo like thrillers, and it led to Italian artists writing their own versions of this, often under like English or American pseudonyms because this genre was not okayed by Mussolini's era, who thought it was glamorizing crime and would negatively influence, quote, weak-minded Italians. So he thought that they were a bad influence on the culture, which is somewhat ironic. But anyway, so I just think that's really funny how, like, the term giallo just means yellow. So now it's just become, yellow is just synonymous with, like, thrillers because of this really famous line of covers and like translated works of crime novels. So I just think that's very fun. And of course, you know, the first giallo movie is typically cited as Mario Bava's 1962 whodunit, The Girl Who Knew Too Much. Another Dario Argento film, which is The Bird with the Crystal Plumage from 1969. But they really get their stride in like the 70s, this kind of subgenre. And so typical tropes as categorized by the font and body and archive of all knowledge, Wikipedia. It involves like a murder mystery, whodunit, plot, the identity of the killer is kept a secret. The protagonist is usually a kind of outsider, maybe like a tourist. Often if they're a woman, then they're kind of a lonely woman or maybe a woman who's like been to therapy. These are kind of the predecessor to like American slashers, and some of these famous giallos have influenced later slashers that were to come. Beautiful women are often the victims. There's a lot of gore, excessive bloodletting. There's numerous violent deaths. These films are often quite stylish. We have camera switches to the killer's POV. There's such an element of voyeurism, which is explored. There are creepy close-ups, very dizzying pans. There's lots of tracking shots, often very colorful sets, and it's all usually over some sort of dramatic musical arrangement. It can be considered quite camp. There's mostly just emphasis on plot and surprise, and characterization kind of takes a back seat in these movies, or quality dialogue. They're just not really the focus. It's more about kind of the shock value of the deaths and the killer reveal. They typically explore themes of sexuality, particularly female sexuality, mental illness, which is often explored through like hallucinations or paranoia, trauma, which we often get through flashback scenes. They tackle taboos, they tackle themes of tourism, alienation, the theme of like detection, and then also just unreliable testimony from witnesses. There's also a kind of Italian, another subgenre, which is more about like police detective shows, and they're more to do with like rogue, violent cops or corrupt law enforcement officers. And giallo films there's some overlap, but they're quite a distinct thing. But yeah, they're kind of two distinct genres with some overlap. But giallo is typically like more into like these horror slasher sequences, more excessively violent and not so action orientated as that subgenre. And then I guess the last thing is that though there are like known established tropes, this genre is quite global, and oftentimes, like with any kind of horror subgenre, there are established tropes that are then deliberately subverted or played with. So not every giallo is going to have these characteristics. They kind of play around.
Like you said, it's a really global genre and obviously specific to Italy, but like because the cast is often international, and also like giallo films were so inspired by Hitchcock and like American psychological thrillers. I think the visual imagery and the narratives they use are really familiar to people that are already familiar with like Hitchcockian type horrors or thrillers. It's an interesting like dipping your toe into like non-English speaking horror, because it's like quite familiar and then just has a very like transnational aspect, but also some very distinctly Italian stylistics and fun campiness.
Gary Needman also goes in to talk about how giallo is, and as a genre, is like kind of useful if you want to like talk about certain themes, but he also doesn't think that he thinks it resists categorization in the same way that like American film subgenres kind of have such a strict characterization, of like what they are. And he thinks it resists generic definition. And he also talks about how basically, because of the kind of fact that giallos are in dialogue with previous, like you said, Hitchcockian things, and they're kind of playing off of a lot of different cultural artifacts. Like, I think this is such a self-conscious subgenre because it's born from other trends. So yeah, it does kind of resist any kind of definition in that way.
Same with Korean cinema, which we'll get into with our second episode with I Saw the Devil. Like, it's decentering Hollywood and American cinema as an apex of style and filmmaking.
Gary Needman also points out other films that he considers giallos, like Perfect Blue, the Japanese film, which we've covered on the podcast before. And there's also a Spanish film called A Dragonfly for Each Corpse from 1974. There's a Belgian film called The Pencil Murders from 1982. Quite interesting, I think. Argento, someone identified his own kind of interesting giallo tropes. Paul Flanagan, for Contamination Horror, an article called Aberrant Sexuality in Tenebrae, talks about how in a lot of Argento's films from this kind of era, his male protagonists often suffer from some sort of impaired vision, whether it's kind of literally or they're like frustrated by not being able to see a full piece of the puzzle. This writer goes on to cite a few examples across Argento's work, but in Tenebrae specifically, the assistant witnesses a murder and sees the killer, but forgets this detail in his like trauma having witnessed the murder. He kind of has a metaphorically kind of impaired sight. And then, of course, the actual detective is he openly admits to being unable to solve crimes in novels by Agatha Christie, Ed McBain, and Mickey Spillane. But he then says, I found the killer, and I discovered the killer in your book, to Neil. The irony is that he does not see the actual wider, bigger picture and to know that there are like two killers. So yeah, it's the fact that these characters kind of lack insight. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of theme to have throughout Argento's work. If you compare it to the female character, Maria, who stumbles upon the lair and sees too much and is killed for it.
I'm curious if any of you guessed the killer, saw any plot twists coming.
I guessed wrong many times. I fell for every red herring. I'm foolish for real. And honestly, for the longest time, I knew there were more than one. I was like, there has to be more than one. But for the longest time, I thought it was that young man in his sweater vest, because I was like, that sweater vest is too perfect. Like, to get blood on that sweater vest would be like, I don't know, satisfying. The English guy with the blonde hair, like, he was just so buttoned up and too perfect, and he's like really eager to be there. I'm like, he's got to be. Literally though, like, the girlfriend who's having the affair with the literary agent.
Oh, yeah, Jane.
Yeah, I totally thought it was her for the longest.
That's quite an overt red herring, to be fair.
And even once people were killed, I was like, but they could be in on it. Like, that didn't eliminate them as suspects for me. And I like got myself royally confused.
Did you have a fun time?
Yeah, I had a fun time. I was like so dead ass wrong though. I'm like, I truly feel like a foolish goober for being tricked repeatedly.
I guess the first one pretty quickly, because I think they made that one really obvious, that it was the news guy who was killing the women and leaving the book hints. Like, I think that one was pretty easy. But the second one, initially, I thought it was his assistant who was killing people because she was just so at his beck and call. And I was like, maybe it's her. But then when his ex put on the red high heels, I was like, no, it's him. Because the scene where the lady is wearing the red high heels on the beach, it didn't have like any other character that was in the scene, and it just seemed sort of disjointed at the time when it was happening. And I was like, this looks like America. So I was like, how else would this relate if not to him? So then at that point I was like, well, it has to be him. But I think they did a good job at kind of like throwing you around and trying to make you figure out who it was. There was like several points in the film where I just was like, a character was kind of acting a bit strange. Gianni like kicks the girl off his bike in the middle of nowhere, and then she shows up dead, and he like does not react at all, like does not say, oh my god, me and her got in a fight and I dropped her off in the middle of nowhere. He just pretends like he was never there. He never saw her. The police don't question him because he was the last person who was seen with her, and people saw him leave the hotel with her, but like it never comes up. He's not even questioned as a suspect. And I was like, the police are doing a really bad job here. You're asking the writer to help you find the killer. You're not even wondering why this man was with this girl and then she showed up dead. An inconsistent murder to the rest of the people because she was the first one with the axe. And so I was like, I mean, it might have not even been related. It could have been someone just pretending it was related. Yeah, the police in this movie, I don't think they were intended to look as incompetent, but they were giving incompetent.
I think they were pretty, like, moderately good compared to the incompetence we usually see in horror films.
He left a person in the house without checking to see if he was dead and came back surprised that he used a toy knife.
Again, moderately good compared.
I'm not gonna lie, though. The death was pretty convincing.
5 seconds to check a pulse.
What is he, a doctor?
They are supposed to check the pulse.
You have to give it on the call and say the suspect is down. I check their pulse.
Guys, we've just talked about giallo as playful, campy. We don't need to get into the realism or lack thereof.
I mean, another person in this movie who was genuinely just a lost cause was Anne, his assistant. Why are you crying over a man who was like pretending to be sad about killing you?
Well, that would be shocking.
I actually was in the It's Anne camp, which I stayed in that camp for so long. Like, I stayed into that camp till the very end because I thought she was gonna like attack the cop in the car. I was like, there's no way. Like, she's gonna do something and like reveal that she was in on it or something like that. But then it just like it ended with her screaming her head off, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe she wasn't. Maybe she wasn't
You were
involved.
like, okay, innocence proved, I guess.
Yeah.
For the longest time, I thought the killer had to be a woman because, like, the very first scene with dialogue they set up of, like, sexism is wrong. And I was like, okay, that's going to be the message of it, is that we shouldn't have assumed the killer was a man. Like, a woman can be a killer, too.
That's a big brain interpretation.
There was, like, a shoplifter. I was like, it's got to be a woman. But no.
No, but on that, I actually think this is such a clever film. I mean, we talk about giallo as being a kind of self-conscious genre in general, but this film is particularly self-conscious in that he quite literally has a character who is a giallo kind of writer. Although he's not Italian, he's supposed to be an American author, but still, you know, he kind of has like a giallo book. According to various sources, which are quoted on Wikipedia, that he basically, when Argento was in the States and he was writing Inferno after Suspiria like took off and he was writing the sequel, he had an obsessive fan who was like, I'm such a fan, and it got gradually more menacing. Then the fan kind of started saying that you ruined my life and started sending him like death threats. So he had to actually go back or leave Santa Monica and return to Italy because of these threats. And he said that he felt these threats were symptomatic of that city of broken dreams with its celebrity stalkers and senseless crime. And at the same time, there was also in the 1980s, there was also this murder of a Japanese tourist, like a shooting. So he said these two instances kind of like the idea of like senseless murder and a stalker acted as influences for Tenebrae. So yeah, there is like definitely, I feel like, an autobiographical, maybe more so than other films, drive to this particular film. So it's just very meta. There are a lot of layers. Like we've got a kind of giallo film and the plot is based on like a giallo book, and he's in dialogue with what it means to be an artist who depicts like women getting violently murdered. And I want to return back to this point, but one critic, Thomas Rostock, has identified that there's a lot of doubling in this film in general, but one specific point is the fact that you might view Neil, the author, as like Argento's kind of maybe tongue-in-cheek alter ego because of that confrontation between Tilde, who love how she's like buddy with him and then like sits him down and rips him a new one in an interview, love that, but who basically is like, it's a sexist novel, why do you despise women so much, and then like forces him to confront it. And I think that whole dialogue is quite poignant in just, I mean, it's kind of ironic because Neil kind of says like, you've known me for 10 years, like you know me, and she's like, we're talking about your work, and he's like, what do you need me to say, that I support equal rights amendment? And like she tries to go back, and I think it's like such a good example of like how casually dismissive men are. And then of course the ironic thing is he does hold these misogynistic beliefs, and the film is kind of paradoxically proving that there isn't a kind of distinction between artist and work. But that's all very funny because Argento himself is kind of using the fact that he's gotten a lot of this criticism, as other critics have pointed out, that he's sexist and so on, who points out that like him saying like, okay, well, this killer is actually depraved, but I'm not. But now I've given you an artist who is sexist and depraved, you know, and it's kind of funny. But there is this critic, James Gracie, who goes in and talks about like how Argento has a kind of complicated, you know, relationship with, shall we say, how he depicts women and what he says about women. Like in the past, he said things like, I like women, especially beautiful ones. If they have a good face and figure, I would much prefer to watch them being murdered than an ugly girl or a man. And he's faced kind of criticisms or accusations of misogyny as a result of this. And this was said on The Quietus. Like I said, it's James Gracie writing this up. It's a similar kind of response as well to like when Tilde questions him and he's like, I love women, you know, that's what Peter Neal says, the character. But then Gracie goes on to say that he thinks that Argento kind of complicates gender politics because it's not as quote unquote rigidly polarized. And I'm reading here, but his stories rely heavily on strong female characters and quite often men with ambiguous gender identities. Tenebrae's flashbacks reveal a woman who sexually humiliates the killer, but this woman is actually portrayed by a transgender actress named Eva Robbins. Basically, this casting might like show that Argento is interested in playing with gender and sexuality and what defines it a little bit more broadly. That might be giving it too much credit, but essentially I think this is all really an interesting discussion that Argento's having with almost himself and his own critics in this film, and really playing with that.
Relatedly, I wanted to talk about the nudity. Like, I think, not that I didn't expect it. Maybe I didn't expect it in the way it was delivered. Like it was like with a side of parsley, really. Like it was just so intentional. Like it would just be like one titty out of a robe. Knowing that this genre is built off of a lot of existing horror and thriller tropes. I think in a lot of stalker, serial killer, killer POV types of American movies, there's a lot of implied nudity and implied sexuality. It did something different. Like sometimes I think when we're watching those like very, very classic American horror films and we're like, oh, the knife is penetration. Sometimes it feels like a reach, like depending on how the kill happens or how the violence occurs. When we compare it to sex, sometimes it feels like a reach because we know the tropes, but you kind of have to know the tropes to know that like what is happening intentionally or subconsciously. And this, it was so beats you over the head with it. I love it. I think it's like interesting, as Louisa said, and like contradictory and absolutely in conversation with all the classic things people say about sexuality in horror. Like it's very, like Louisa said again, like aware of itself, but like it is gratuitous. I think as fun as it is to like watch and enjoy, and it is like I don't know, it intellectually I understand what he's doing, but I'm also like, wow, you're really like serving it to us on a platter. And it's kind of not careless. Careless isn't the word. It's intentional, but it's like it kind of feels like a fuck you a little bit. Like you know, like how like I'm gonna do whatever I want. So I feel a little guilty in like enjoying the over the topness of it, and like it is camp. The nudity is camp, a part of the camp. But I wondered what y'all's thoughts were on that.
I'm glad that you like finished with this sense, like commenting on that sense of guilt that you feel enjoying it or like partaking in it, because I think that like Louisa and you touched on, a lot of the films kind of like, I think what makes the film great is that like ongoing dialogue he's obviously having with himself as a filmmaker, as an artist, as this pioneer of horror, and somebody who takes beautiful women and slashes them up on screen in a very erotic manner. That's all done so, like, in my opinion, masterfully. But I feel like he takes it a step further, and what kind of made me like absolutely adore this film. Like, and I agree, Zeba, I think that Argento is not like without criticism, but it's more like as a filmmaker I can like give props to. Like I'm not going to speak on like any sort of moral ground in terms of like depictions of violence. That's kind of like what the whole podcast is about. But I think that as well as him being very self-aware and poking fun at his role as this sort of perpetrator of on-screen violence in that sense through the character of the author, in the way that the author plays with the audience and like the director does, like there's all of that kind of like playfulness and self-awareness, and it serves this violence on a platter because it's like he knows that the audience knows that this is like visually how horrors depict violence against women, and it's often like intertwined with sex and eroticism. But I think that like what he does in this film and his other films is he implicates the audience like quite strongly in this. So it's not just I'm a pervert director, because like frankly he is. I think the best horror directors are perverts, and he even like throws that around in the film. Like the killer calls the victims filthy pervert, dirty spy. Like there's this sense of punishment he's enacting, especially with the opening scene with the murder. Like it's followed very quickly by the flash of the camera straight into the lens. There's this sense of like awareness, and like it's sort of shown back to us that we're obviously like taking part in viewing this like in a sort of voyeuristic way. But then also later on with Gianni, when he's being strangled in the car, the guy behind him, there's a really interesting like angle of Gianni as he's trying to turn to see who it is, and he looks basically right at the camera to look for the killer. And I just think that like in a really a self-aware kind of tongue-in-cheek and ultimately fucking brilliant way, Argento is being like, I'm the dirty pervert and so are you for watching this and enjoying it. Because I think that these films, they're beautiful they toe the line with exploitative and that sort of the violence we always talk about in slashes against women. And I'm not saying that, like, in conclusion, Argento is like absolved of, his potential hidden misogyny, like Louisa, you said, that ironically the author is also sort of battling with. I'm not saying that like he's absolved of that, because look at how self-aware and clever this film is. I just think that like through the many layers of like meta cinema this is, that's what just like makes it so like fantastic to me. I share, Zeba, your like sense of guilt over that a bit, because I'm kind of like, yeah, why do I like it so much?
I remember on our Suspiria episode, one of the things that we talked about was how there was no gratuitous nudity and it didn't feel very voyeuristic. It just felt very much like we were sort of watching what people would do in a dance school, but without everyone having to be nude in changing rooms. But in this one, there's even like just the scene of Tilda's girlfriend and she's like going down the stairs in this drenched towel, like sweaty. I was like, I don't know, like if you hear a noise, I think the first instinct is to like put on clothes if you hear a noise. As a woman, like
there were so many nipples in this, like nobody was wearing a bra ever. They had these thin little shirts and their nipples were
This
out.
was the definition of on Twitter when they're like talking about sexist authors, like she tittied boobily down the stairs.
And there were several moments in the film where I was like even in his flashback of the scene on the beach and she like takes off her shirt and is like sitting there and I was like, are we about to watch her like do something where she's just sitting there like rubbing the guy's thighs on her knees topless? And I was like,
yes, Tyia, they were gonna gangbang. There
were just several, I think, moments where like you really saw sort of the sexism that Tilda is like speaking of in it. And it's interesting too, because I think both of the critiques that he gets in the film, well, the author gets in the film, Peter, are very obviously in the film. So there's this sexism and why do you treat women the way that you do in the film? Why does the killer have to kill the women? And the killer was originally only killing women. And he also kept saying like they were the cause of all these perversions. And then there's also like the flip of the perversion and allowing the audience to sort of take part in corrupting them. But also in the sense, I feel like the perversions shown in the film are kind of like each a different aspect. Like we have the first lady who's like theft. We have someone who's supposed to be like a spy. We have the lesbians who didn't do anything wrong. Although I will argue Tilda's girlfriend was being a bitch. She was not into that. She was genuinely upset. I think it's totally fine to like do whatever if your partner is into it, but she was genuinely pissed off. Like they were actually having a fight. It wasn't like a this is sexy thing. Yeah, that was kind of like her partner is kind of shitty for that one. Each person kind of did something shitty within the film or did something that was like sort of perverse, but also there's like these angles where we like directly take on like a first person view and you don't see anyone, you just sort of see what's happening in the scene, which is what makes it feel like the audience is also part of like the perversion of what's being expressed in the film. Because there's like the initial angle when he's like walking up to the lady in the red heels to take them for his ex and kills her. It's just like completely from like a first person angle. There's like, even I think Tilda, when she gets murdered, it like flips and it's as if you're the person killing her. Like Mila was saying, like the audience is kind of being blamed as like you are the perverts, but I also kind of think it's like taking accountability in a sense of like, I'm taking you on this ride and sort of corrupting you. It's interesting to watch because I initially was like very put off by the nudity, but then at some point it kind of felt like it was sort of there on purpose to sort of like, I guess, provoke people into being like, yeah, this is the sexism you requested. Here is the voyeurism that you requested on display for you. But I was not emotionally prepared for it because I watched this like early in the morning on a Friday. The last time that I saw this film was probably like 4 or 5 years ago. So I was like sitting there with like my cup of tea, like a calm lavender tea, being like, it's titties everywhere. What's happening? And my mom was in the room. She was like, what's going on? So at the moment, it was a lot. I can't say that I was enjoying the excessive nudity or the perversity of the film. I was just kind of like, this is getting to be a lot.
So the first time the Luma crane had been used in production, in Italian production, was in this film. It's essentially the tracking shot that goes up the house that the lesbians, shall we say, live in. First of all, apparently that shot took like days to make, and it's only like 2 minutes because Argento insisted. But also it's like quite, as critics have said, like meaningless, because it's not actually something like the killer couldn't really climb it himself. Like it was so unrealistic. Like no one would be able to scale that building like that unless he's Spider-Man. So it's basically just to make the audience do it. So I guess it's like, again, just going with what Mila was saying, forcing you in that POV of the killer. Not even POV of the killer, forcing you to just spy on your own accord. So I agree, it is like a kind of fuck you, or like, as we were discussing earlier, it's a fuck you of like, I'm gonna make you a pervert. If you think I'm a pervert, you're a pervert for enjoying. Zeba, did you say that earlier on that you kind of thought it was doing something different with psychosexual kind of murders?
Just that it was more overt, like that everybody else kind of has to tiptoe around it, and this was like really beating you over the head with it. So not different, but like it's not even as subtle as a nod. It's just amplifying what we already know to be the grand metaphor, violence and sex.
And it's giving the kind of classic Creedian take of like penetration is phallic. I think there's so many overt, obvious, monstrous feminine things that we have in here. One film scene example is just the woman in red stilettos who like kind of taunts Neil sexually, or Peter Neil sexually, kicks his genitals, orally kind of rapes him with her heel in his mouth. She like metaphorically castrates him, right? And then of course we then see him take revenge. And it's a very psychosexual revenge. He's kind of stabbing her. It's like asserting dominance. It does feel like a kind of retaliatory rape almost. Then have a kind of similar thing with Neil feeling metaphorically castrated by his ex, and he even sends her the red stilettos, and we can kind of see this like psychosexual transfer, a little Freudian transference going on. Then he kind of, again, literally, almost not literally, but again kind of metaphorically or physically castrates her and like chopping off her arm. And I agree it feels like really over the top. Like I don't feel like you're really searching for like that castration element. I mean, we have a quote from the beginning of the movie, which is from the novel, but then becomes a kind of meta like mantra for the main character of the film. The impulse has become irresistible. There was only one answer to the fury that tormented him, and so he committed his first act of murder. He had broken down the most deep-rooted taboo and found not guilt, not anxiety or fear, but freedom. Every humiliation which stood in his way could be swept away by the simple act of annihilation, murder. I mean, I think he is like over the top, almost presenting like a violent male psychology, and then saying like, this is what you expect of me. And then it's almost like, if you're surprised by Peter being the killer, then he's almost calling the audience dumb for having that assumption of like him, that he'd be sexist. Because like, see, you do recognize that there's some distance between an artist and his work because you didn't guess the killer or something. Or if you did do it, then well done. But I feel like that's his way of being like, of course there's separation. Like, why would he be the murderer? Why would you have thought that? So I almost feel like in going towards this like kind of trite ending, he is trying to make a little bit of a mockery of the audience for if they are surprised by the whodunit that he did in fact do it. I mean, that's just like one perspective of it, because I know he's also kind of building on Hitchcockian motivation. So there are other films which obviously had the kind of main character turn out to be the killer as well. So if you're kind of aware of that body of work, then potentially you're not as surprised by the killer. But I do think there might be that kind of element to it.
The presence of lesbians allowed for these this wonderful writing in the screenplay. The first was, and this is after Louisa you'd mentioned Tilda basically like criticizing Peter's sexist writing and tropes that he uses in his crime novels. Like it's after that scene as Peter's walking away with his agent that he says those dykes want your balls because they don't have their own, which I think is a refreshing, just little subversion of penis envy.
As we kind of talked about in our zine explaining what the monstrous feminine is, we talk about how Creed writes that penis envy is used in horror to create a basis that we fear women's bodies because they're castrated, but she's like, no, it's because they have the ability to castrate. And of course, every woman who's killed here is a kind of castrating woman, so to speak, metaphorically. And of course, the shall we say, small dick energy journalist who goes around killing women in the first act is also killing like quite sexually liberated women, like, you know, a queer couple. He kills like a woman who's offering sex in exchange for her crime to go unreported. He then hunts down or wants to kill a sex worker. So the only person he kills who isn't like has that kind of sexual liberation is Maria, but he just kills her out of convenience to keep going. And yeah, talks about how he needs to keep killing these like deviant sexual people.
Yeah, I liked what you said, just how that quote at the beginning from the novel, in a sense, like laying out exactly who the killer is, but through like various red herrings and whatever. You're not supposed to guess because, yeah, like you said, there could be this like final fuck you in terms of the separation between art and artist. I think that just like in terms of serial killers, looking at murder as this freedom for Peter, like I don't know, to me that seems like kind of unique in terms of like the psychology that you often see with serial killers. I'm not like saying that Argento would be going for psychological, psychosexual accuracy, quote unquote, in terms of like creating the motivations of this character. But I do think it's interesting to make that distinction that like murder for him, like obviously contextualized within his sort of like sexual humiliation by the woman in the red heels and sort of symbolic rape. That was initially in retaliation for him hitting her across the face. Obviously, this is all metaphorical within the film, but I don't know, there's something about like presenting his urge to kill women as this freedom. I wonder if it's freedom from, we always talk about obviously like violence in horror as transposed onto female bodies because it's like a threat to the symbolic order. So like enacting violence in some way like protects that. I wonder if it's can be like viewed in a similar way. Like obviously he's rooting it in this sort of like sexual impulse and need for like domination through this humiliation that he suffered. It does like kind of paint it as this sort of male issue. Do you know what I mean? Like it's so gendered and it's so within a pattern of a man being humiliated by women in a sexual context breeds killers, which is obviously like simplistic, but unfortunately like fucking evident still to this day. Like that's just a narrative that plays out.
When they were initially theorizing who was the serial killer, there was the conversation with Gianni, Peter, and Anne, and they keep referring to the killer as a male, and Anne interjects and says like, no, like her. and so I think that definitely helps with a red herring of thinking maybe it's Anne or maybe it's his. I don't know if she's actually his ex, because when he confesses at the end, he refers to her as his fiance. So I'm not sure if they actually were split up, because they say like he was sleeping with your fiance, like having an affair with her. There's just the moment of like him telling Anne sort of like, oh, she's not there to like be in the way of us wanting to be together. And she suggests that Jane may want him back, but it seems as though he may just be playing with Anne and still be with Jane the entire time.
Yeah, I viewed it as like, you know how when men are like refer to their ex still as like a present, like possession, you know, even though they're broken up, there's still like this sense of ownership that lingers even after a breakup. That's kind of how I took that. But I understood it as they were broken up, but I don't know when the affair started. You'd still feel a little cucked, wouldn't you, if your ex went with your agent? I mean, do I see any general serial killer things in tropes or whatever in this film? I don't know about like the general canon of like crime, true crime genre serial killers, because I feel like they're much more, shall we say, serious in their depiction. What I do see is that almost camp, like slasher serial killer stereotype, particularly at the end when he's kind of depicted as like having lost his mind. I do see like that kind of gender anxiety that we have in a lot of older horror films. You've kind of mentioned like sexuality being tied to like his masculinity, and is this like a particular male issue? And there's this critic, Maitland McDonough, who says that Tenebrae is fraught with, I quote, free-floating anxiety that is specifically sexual in nature. I agree, and I think there are those like really obvious, as we discussed, like psychosexual stabbings that are like in your face and like misogynistic. But then also underneath, I think there could potentially be maybe a crisis of sexuality that's like happening, particularly because I do think like in this era potentially casting like a trans woman, whether or not, I'm not sure if like her gender history was known in the role, but Eva Robbins playing the first villainess in the repressed memory being trans, and then like that whole scene felt a little bit homoerotic with the men surrounding, like holding him down. Like it did feel like this collective rape, which obviously was like channeled then towards women and internalized. But yeah, it did feel like there is this kind of like homosexual charge to that whole group humiliation element. And it's just interesting because that scene is apparently a direct reference to the American mystery film Suddenly Last Summer, which is based on a play from Tennessee Williams. And yeah, it's like referencing when she's like kneeling down in the white and wearing white in the sand. It's a direct reference to Elizabeth Taylor. And that whole plot is about basically a homosexual male. So it's just like an interesting reference to have made in that scene, which seems to be fraught with like sexual trauma. And then that becomes the kind of basis for the whole film and then target, like, you know what I mean? I don't know. I feel like there's some underlying gender anxiety that we see in a lot of like serial killer villains, especially at their most unhinged. I'm thinking Psycho right now. And that seems like characteristic of serial killer films, that like crisis of sexuality, crisis of gender. But I don't really see like in terms of like similarities with like serious true crimes, because I feel like this is more of an unserious subgenre. Fun, but unserious.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at The MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at The Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.